Hello and welcome to the fourth and final episode of the MAPS Canada Expert Edition webinar series, the Ethnobotany of Psychoactive Plants. My name is Michael Oliver and I am your host for this mini-series. This series is open to anyone and we hope that you might feel inclined to share it with your friends if you enjoy today's episode. We do encourage donations as well if you are in a position to give, and your support goes a long way in helping us work towards the legalization of psychedelics. MAPS Canada is a non-profit charity that relies entirely on public donations to help us achieve our mission of expanding safe access for psychedelic medicines for all Canadians. To learn more about MAPS Canada and the work that we're doing, you can check us out at www.mapscanada.org. So before we get to the presentation today, we just have a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. So specifically for those of you that might be new to Crowdcast, if this is your first time attending a Crowdcast event, we just want to orient you to a couple of features. So on the right of your screen, you'll see the chat. This is where you can have conversations with other attendees. And then at the bottom of your screen, if you look there, you'll see a tab that says Ask a Question. So this is an important button for you to be aware of. At any time during today's presentation, you can type in a question there for Chris. And then towards the end of today's episode, we're going to be reserving quite a bit of time to go through all those questions. And during the event, you can actually go and see the questions that other people are asking, and you can upvote those questions. And so we're going to be going through the questions based on popularity. So the questions that are upvoted the most. Episodes of the series will be recorded and available to watch again right here in Crowdcast. So if you miss an episode, you can just follow the invite link to view the replay. And so all of the previous 3 episodes are on Crowdcast as well. So if you have any questions about Crowdcast or the webinar as a whole, or you have any trouble accessing these episodes, just make sure to reach out to webinar@mapscanada.org. So for this series, we have been joined by special guest Chris Kilham. Chris Kilham is a medicine hunter, explorer, lifelong yogi, psychedelic advocate, and media personality. He has investigated medicinal plants among indigenous people globally for decades, from Siberia to the Amazon and to the Congo. Chris is the author of 15 books, including the international bestseller, The 5 Tibetans, Ayahuasca Test Pilot's Handbook, and The Lotus and the Bud, Cannabis, Consciousness, and Yoga Practice. Chris has appeared on over 2,000 radio, 500 TV programs, and the New York Times calls Chris part David Attenborough, part Indiana Jones. Each episode of this series has focused on different plant medicines, with today's episode spotlighting cannabis. Drawing upon more than 30 journeys to the Amazon and experiences with dozens of Amazonian shamans, it is my pleasure to introduce Chris Kilham to the Expert Edition stage. Welcome, Chris.
Oh, thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate this very much. And I also want to express my gratitude once again to MAPS Canada for hosting this series and for, really giving people the opportunity to learn a little bit more about the ethnobotany of these various psychoactive agents. The ethnobotany is the relationship between people and plants. And every plant that we utilize, no matter what it is, whether it's corn or coffee or ginkgo, there are people behind it. There are communities behind it. And so that's what I investigate. And what I'd like to do tonight is draw upon, and it's sort of like, I find it even a little bit incredible to say, just because time goes by so very, very quickly. But I'd like to share my 54 years of experience with cannabis and my 51 years of daily yoga practice to bring to you something that is part ethnobotany and also part a fusion of traditional cannabis employment and sort of the modern evolution of yoga. So what I'd like to do is have you come along with me. I'm going to switch over to a presentation here, and let's just see what we got. We got this going here. All right. Okay, I'm going to assume that we're okay unless I am told otherwise. Oh, shoot. All right. What's happening? Tonight's talk, the name is Cannabis, Shiva, and Kundalini. And here's a bright and friendly picture of me taken by a wonderful photographer named Tracy Eller. We were in Colorado, people grow, as you probably do know. I know there's great ganja growing all over the world, but this was a ganja plant. I don't know, about the size of an apple tree, and it just seemed like a great place to pose. And I also want to draw your attention to this sign, which I think could be a foretelling of the future. In Jamaica, at a bakery, they made it very clear that they did not want any tobacco present, but they were not at all averse to ganja, to people smoking cannabis. So I think we're in a little bit of a changing world, and much of that is good news. I started out in in 1967, the first time anybody ever gave me any cannabis, it was apparently some very, very fine Hawaiian cannabis. And my friend and I smoked it, and he was used to it and I wasn't. And he got very, very high and had an amazing time. Absolutely nothing happened to me. And I really wanted it to, I just thought, like, oh, come on. I mean, maybe, but it just never really happened. Fortunately, I had a rematch about a couple of months later, and that was very successful. And then I understood a little bit better what all the fuss was about. So let's turn our attention right now to cannabis sativa, which many people argue is the most diversely useful and beneficial plant on earth. And I do want to say at the onset that the naming of cannabis from a botanical standpoint has been a constant tug of war between different camps. There are those camps out there who say that there's cannabis sativa, that there's cannabis indica, and there's cannabis ruderalis. And in fact, the entire global cannabis industry has been built on hybrids and crossbreeds of all of these theoretical different species. However, many botanists, myself included, would say that's really nonsense, that it in fact is all cannabis sativa, and that whether you're talking about broadleaf hemp or narrowleaf hemp, or broadleaf psychoactive cannabis or narrowleaf psychoactive cannabis, that they are all in fact cannabis sativa. So that's how I mention it here, and we'll leave it for people in the market to fight out. But I think the botany is really with us on this being one genus and species. But in any case, I want to turn a little bit to the phytochemistry of cannabis, because this is where this is one of the things that makes cannabis so special. I'm not focusing on hemp at this point in time. I'm not focusing on fiber and textile use at all, or the making of hemp plastic, or any of the many fine things that hemp is useful for, including environmental remediation. I really want to focus on psychoactive cannabis and talk about how this also fits into yoga and to general spiritual pursuits, and kind of what we see coming in the future. So first of all, cannabis contains cannabinoids. We're familiar with THC, its non-decarboxylized form, 9-tetrahydrocannabinol, also CBD, which is cannabidiol. But there are about 113 cannabinoids that have been identified so far. So cannabis is this rich powerhouse of cannabinoids. And as you probably know, we manufacture 2 cannabinoids in our bodies, but often we do not manufacture enough to satisfy the needs of a system I'll be talking about in a little bit. And so supplementing ourselves with cannabis, which is the best exogenous source, that is outside the body source of cannabinoids, may be a very, very smart idea. People, in fact, may have cannabinoid deficiencies. But cannabis is also rich in aromatic terpenes, and it's really rich in antioxidant compounds. Keep in mind that plants contain hundreds and hundreds of compounds. Most of what interests us, however, with cannabis lies not in the interior of the plant, in the intercellular spaces, which is typical of most plants, but on the surface, on glandular-like protrusions called trichomes. And those are the jewels, the glistening gems on cannabis buds that actually are rich in cannabinoids, terpenes, and many, though not all, of the antioxidant compounds in this remarkable plant. I'd like to propose that psychoactivity is great activity. Many of us have been raised to believe that there's something wrong or suspicious or less or deleterious or somehow just not quite right about getting high. And yet, in fact, I'll tell a quick story. When I was a kid, I think I may have told this on one of the other seminars, but when I was a kid growing up in the greater Boston area, there was a radio station that advertised that on a certain evening, like that week, they were going to broadcast live from a pot party in Boston. And this was very, very risque, and it was really secret, and they'd promised not to say where it was and all of that. And, you know, the education that most of us had was that getting high was a terrible thing. And if you smoked marijuana, you were going to wind up dead in an alley with a needle in your arm. So that was the progression of thought back then. And I remember tuning in and listening to this show and listening to the announcer going around the party and talking with people. And first of all, none of them sounded crazy. They mostly sounded like they were having a very good time. They sounded intelligent. And I remember standing there as a 10-year-old or so going, gee, you know, this sounds like a lot of fun to me. In any case, on the left-hand side, we have a neon dancing smoking bear in a window in Amsterdam, which, as many people know, is an epicenter of cannabis activity and cannabis tourism. I like this expression that I've used many times in many talks, that true healing puts into order the body, mind, and spirit with the past, the present, and the future. It is the case that the expansiveness of getting high is in and of itself, if it's not abused, generally a healing experience. Gives people a sense of satisfaction, sense of pleasure. This releases all kinds of good endorphins in the body. This is nothing but good news. And despite the hysteria that we've had around cannabis for a long, long time, please remember that in all of human history, we do not know of a single death caused by cannabis. Not one. So this is a remarkably safe agent, and one of the things that we need to work on eliminating in the cannabis scene is the sense of guilt, because psychoactivity is great activity. People get inspired, people get creative. This is good stuff. Now, the question is, and of course you know the answer to this, is cannabis also medicine? And by the way, this is one of my plants. I grow every year. We're allowed to in Massachusetts. And it's wonderful to be out tending the plants, having that energy exchange with the plants for months. Just wonderful. Just the other day, I checked on this on the National Institutes of Health. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration has not recognized or approved the marijuana plant as medicine. Now, given that we've had a marijuana medicine program sponsored by the United States government since the 60s at the University of Mississippi, this is obviously hilarious nonsense, especially when you consider the U.S. government's patent on cannabis focusing on needs of the nervous system. This patent filed in 2003 and filed basically on behalf of the Department of Health and Human Services. And if you look at this, you see that this really focuses on application for neuroprotection, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, and a number of things that have to do with the nervous system. So for a long time, the United States government has known full well that cannabis is not only profoundly medicinal, but it's profoundly medicinal for many of the things that really harm people as they age-related dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. So we have to accept fully that our governments have lied to us. They do lie to us. They will continue to lie to us about this issue. And that's why we're very fortunate to have thriving black markets or non-licensed markets that are flourishing around the world, where people who really care about plants and plant spirit and have a great respect for the plant are cultivating and making available high quality cannabis for people's enjoyment. Many years ago, I was in the Siberian Altai, and I'll come back to this slide in a minute, but if you look on this map, you see the Russian Federation and China, and in southern Siberia, in that circled area, you have the Altai. When I was there investigating an entirely other plant, Rhodiola rosea, a profoundly beneficial adaptogenic herb that's very good for the brain and for energy, endurance, and stamina. And I was traveling with some people who were traders, and we were driving along in the Altai, and I kept seeing, everywhere we went, I kept seeing these plants, and I asked to stop. And I got out, and in all directions, if it wasn't a tree, if it wasn't a house, if it wasn't a road, it was cannabis. And we traveled through about 800 or so, 850 miles of cannabis, millions and millions of tons of cannabis growing in the Altai. After the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago, cannabis, which had existed previously across Eurasia, cannabis re-emerged in this area. And this area is today the cannabis breadbasket of the world. There is more cannabis there than any place. And I wondered if this was psychoactive. And so, being a good field researcher and wanting to get correct data, I decided to perform a bioassay. And I harvested some buds, and I was staying at a science center just for a couple of nights, and I managed to dry this cannabis, and then had a hilarious interaction in a grocery store where everybody but me spoke Russian and spoke Altai, for that matter, getting somebody to sell me rolling papers and matches. It was a wonderful moment. I really felt like a mime. In any case, cannabis dates back about 19 million years to the Tibetan plateau. A recent study of pollen samples going way back into antiquity, the earliest sample showing any cannabis dates back 19 million years, a very, very long time. So completely prior to the last ice age. We know, or we have good evidence, that cannabis actually diverged or emerged from hops about 28 million years ago, and the two plants separated and made their own ways again in central northern Asia. So cannabis has been with us for a very, very long time. And yes, this basket on the right is a basket of some of my freshly harvested buds from last year. So the first vaporizer, I want to talk about this. This is kind of exciting, actually. Vaporizer technology is not new. It goes back about 2,500 years. This image is the Borohora Shan in Xinjiang, which is the far northwest of China, where right now the Uyghur people are the subject of a hideous genocide, brutal imprisonment, torture, operations that they don't ask for, indentured servitude in the cotton trade. It's a mess there now. But when I was there, the Borohora Shan, which is the mountain range that you see in this slide, and the Naladi grasslands, the grassy area before it, These are famous, beautiful places in far northwestern China. And it's also here that the Scythians, nomadic people who lived in this general region, made a tent. They made a felt tent. And they'd have hot stones on the inside of this from a fire, and they would march in with armloads of cannabis, although Herodotus initially thought that it was just seeds, which it was not. Subsequent investigation, archaeological evidence shows that it was really the flowering tops and the bracts and the seeds in total. They would close the tent, throw this stuff on the stones, and breathe the vapors, breathe these fumes, these bursting cannabinoids and rich terpenes, just poof, going off in a vapor in this enclosed felt tent. And then they would come out of the tent and shouting for joy and frolicking around. Sounds a lot like the way we were as teenagers after we were through smoking a joint behind the garage, although this is more exotic. Cannabis made its way to India only a few thousand years ago, and also got interwoven into Ayurveda, the science of life. And here you see on this mural the god Dhanvantari. Any place that Ayurveda is practiced, you'll see a representation of Dhanvantari. Dhanvantari has 4 arms. In one hand, a pot containing the elixir of life. In another hand, a chakra or wheel of energy. In another hand, a leech for letting blood. And another hand, a conch shell to blow the note of truth. And Ayurveda uses about 7,500 plants. And cannabis is in there for helping to quell nervousness, for soothing an upset stomach, a little bit for depression. It is just considered a medicinal plant of good worth and value for certain health conditions. In the West, Brooke O'Shaughnessy, back in the 1800s, was really the first Western doctor to recognize and promote cannabis as a medicine, and that primarily for pain. He did a long pain study and saw from his own practice that people given cannabis when they were experiencing pain generally got some relief. So this was kind of a breakthrough thing for cannabis in the West. Additionally, one of the biggest things that ever happened to cannabis historically, and this did come out of India, which is also kind of the epicenter of yoga's origins, was the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission report. And this was like a 3,000-page or a little bit more, 7-volume massive report on cannabis and its use in India and any effects. And basically, the commission concluded that the occasional use of hemp, they called it hemp, in moderate doses may be beneficial, but this use may be regarded as medicinal in character. So even then, they were understanding a medicinal dimension to this, and I would cycle back to psychoactivity being medicinal in and of itself. So I'd like to take you now to the Great Himalayan Mountain region. This is a shot I took a bunch of years ago, standing on a hill in Kosani, where you get really fabulous views. And it looks as though the tops of the Great Himalaya are floating in space, but you can see that they're not. There's a successive series of foothills, and then eventually you get to the great grand snow-capped peaks themselves. And it is here that we have a very strong bridge, a relationship between cannabis and yoga, and it all concerns myths around Shiva. In the Hindu pantheon of gods, you have Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and of the 3 of them, the one who is considered A, the most powerful, and B, a little bit the most crazy, is Shiva. Shiva demonstrates a broad variety of moods, from solemn and in deep bliss to laughing and dancing, drunk and stoned hysterically. I mean, Shiva's all over the place. But in any case, Shiva, at least according to mythology, is the source of yoga and also is the source of cannabis. And supposedly bestowed both yoga and cannabis upon humanity so that people could realize bliss and could experience high ecstatic states of consciousness. It is the case that the tradition of combining yoga and cannabis actually goes back a very long way, but it's really only recent that it's being as widely discussed as it is. Here, I was up in Ranikhet. Ranikhet is in the Kumaon Hill region, beautiful area. And cannabis is not legal in India. But people grow it all over the place. They grow it openly, and they are left alone. And here you can see these rather tall plants. Most people grow a bunch of cannabis in their yards. And this is also an area where you have a greater number of Shiva temples than any other place in India, many of them going back 600, 700, 800 years. And at every Shiva temple, you'll either see a great big ceramic pot with a ganja plant growing in it, or you will see paintings or other representations of cannabis on the temple walls. Usually it's a live plant growing. But here, because cannabis is important for the making of charas, which I'm going to show you shortly, it's grown in superabundance. And my experience with the Himalayan cannabis in this region is that it is spectacularly fragrant. A beautiful, beautiful, evocative floral scent, really rich, almost makes you swoon, and this kind of husky, resinous back note to it. So I have found myself in this region just standing at people's plants, holding one to my nose, because often that's just sufficient enough to, give me a state of reverie. Here you can see up close ganja buds that are frosty with resin glands. And this is important for making hashish. Hashish, as one preparation of cannabis, is widely popular in the Himalayan hill region. And it is really the preferred method of cannabis for most of the people in that area. So here you see a luscious plant. It's got a way to go before it's going to be fully ready to harvest, but already it's frosty with resin glands, and it is the resin glands that contain both the cannabinoids and the aromatic terpenes and many of the beneficial antioxidants. This photograph I did not take. This one I had to get online because I don't have this picture. Charas is really probably the first form of hashish ever made, and there are a few ways to make it. One is to go up to a mature flowering plant and rub your hands up and down kind of briskly on the buds and the plant. Get this sticky stuff on your hands. Rub your hands together. You get little sticky balls of resin. You accumulate those more and more, and eventually you get little fingers of charas. Another way to do it is to harvest the plants, to let them dry for about a day, then pluck off the buds, sit there and furiously rub them back and forth between your hands for about 10 minutes, then discard them, then do it again. Eventually, you accumulate enough resin on your hands, you make little balls of it. Eventually, you've got either balls of charas or fingers of charas. This is what it looks like. And this would be considered a coarse, kind of average charas. Some of it is really, really clean and pure, and you wouldn't necessarily see any slight pieces of additional plant material in it. But this is really the big way that cannabis is used in the Kumaon Himalayan hill region, which is a very, very big region. I was at a temple outside of Rajasthan, in Rajasthan province, outside of Jaipur, a couple hours outside of Jaipur. And here a man was making bhang. Bhang is the name of ganja in general when it's just whole ganja smoked. But also sometimes people will make certain preparations of it that they also call bhang. In this instance, this man has a fist full of flowering tops that have not been dried. He's rubbing and grinding them against a stone that he's standing on. It's a rough stone, so it's sort of like rubbing it against sandpaper. Some of the juice is coming out as he's doing this. It'll all eventually be finely ground. In this instance, he mixes in a little bit of aromatic spice, some cardamom and something else, and then it gets pressed in a handkerchief and dried, and then it's ready to smoke. When I was at this temple, a few men were about to smoke, and it seems to be the case that when I show up at temples, if somebody's firing up something, they invite me, and I always appreciate that. So here you have a man holding the dried bhang in his hand, showing this off. And this goes into the chillum. And the chillum is a conical pipe. It's the most typical type of pipe smoked in India. It's a clay pipe, wide at the top, narrow at the bottom. You typically put a stone down in it so that air will go around the stone, but flaming embers will not. And you tie a rag or a cloth that has been soaked in water and then squeezed out so that you filter the smoke through that. And this is at a Shiva temple in the day, worshiping Shiva. You always start with Om Shiva. So there's this sense of reverie, this sense of connection with spirit, connection with the divine. Among the many interesting characters who populate the Indian temple life and populate the general spiritual scene are the individuals known as sadhus. This also is not a photograph that I took. This is one that I borrowed. And here the sadhus are ferocious ganja smokers. And they renounce home and they renounce possessions for the most part. And they live very simple lives, and they're fed by strangers, and they spend much of their time smoking cannabis and also chanting to God or otherwise praising God in their own various ways. So what I'd like to do is now assemble how cannabis and yoga fit together. Make this a bit more practically understandable for you. Here you have a classic chart of the chakras, which are energy centers, but they are also something else. The 7 chakras are also nerve plexuses. If you open up a body and you look, you will see these bundles of different nerves in different parts of the body, the solar plexus, where the thymus is, other parts of the body. This is where a lot of nerves come together, and these are called plexuses. They are where the chakras are. The chakras, the energy centers, are the electrical energy given off at these centers of nerves. Our nerves carry electrical energy. Our brains carry electrical energy. Our hearts carry electrical energy. We have an estimated 100 billion neurons in our brains alone that give off electrical energy to the tune of 0.07 volts apiece. That adds up to millions of volts of energy. So we have nerves that convey nerve impulses in the form of electricity and also in the form of chemicals that jump from one neuron to another, known as neurotransmitters. And we have this energy that we work with in yoga practice. Here's a good, one of the best, but I want to say botanical, I don't mean that. One of the best physical artists ever was a medical doctor named Frank Netter. He did a series of books for Shiva Pharmaceuticals, one of which was on the nervous system. And this is taken from his book on the nervous system. And you can see that at every segment of the human spine, you have correlating organs and other parts of the body connected to the nerves from those segments. So it is also the case, though, that in yoga, we have a concept of the three main energetic nerve channels. The sushumna, or central channel, which happens to be the spinal cord, and the Ida and the Pingala, that is the moon and sun channels, which happen to be the ganglionic nerve chains which go up alongside of the spinal cord. So at the very same time that we have physical nerves, we also have this massive conveyance of electrical energy going on through them. And these are the energy pathways that we work with in yoga practice. And here you can see, again, the human nervous system, different segments of the human nervous system relating to different organs, to different glands. Nerves run our entire bodies. And it is the case that yoga is largely a practice of the nervous system. As I mentioned, I've been practicing seriously and usually for a couple hours a day for about 51 years. I've had an opportunity to study a great many methods, and it is abundant to me that while many things happen to us as we practice yoga, we're primarily using the nervous system to affect changes all over the body and to affect mind and mood. You can think of nerves the way you think of a piano wire. If you've held a piano wire in your hand, you know it's a tough piece of metal. And if you've ever tuned a piano wire, you just turn it the tiniest little bit because wire doesn't stretch that much. But when you get the wire at the right tension, at the right pitch, you get a beautiful, beautiful sound. Yoga works on the nervous system. The physical postures stretch nerves just enough to affect harmonious flow of energy, to relieve blockages. And so this is a key to yoga practice, even as we're having experiences in our mind of expansion, a greater sense of oneness, which is typical in the yogic process. At the very same time, we have what's known as the ECS, the endocannabinoid system. And you know about this. It wasn't even discovered until the 90s, which is remarkable, but it is a master regulating system. We have cannabinoid receptors throughout our entire bodies, and they are associated with just about everything: fertility, pregnancy, appetite, pain, mood, memory, inflammation, immune function, cardiovascular function, kidney function, and on and on and on. And cannabis, in many instances, acts like a vitamin. It feeds the endocannabinoid system, feeds it THC, feeds it CBD, supports that activity with 113 other cannabinoids, supports that activity with a vast array of terpenes, all of which are not only aromatic, but have biological activities as well. So you get this system that is a harmonizer in general. And it's interesting because yoga also harmonizes our systems too. So here you have another good example of different parts of the endocannabinoid system and the other systems affected by it, which is just about everything. Cannabis-infused yoga is something that has been around for a couple of thousand years. When I have taught previously at yoga conferences, typically how it would go is those of us who were teachers would teach all day, have crowded classes, and then get together in the evenings, smoke some cannabis, and go out to dinner. It wasn't really introduced into the classes at all. But now there's a real shift. As cannabis has become more widely available even than it has been for decades, as medical cannabis has been accepted, as adult use cannabis is now more widely available in more places all over the world. There's also more open discussion about cannabis-infused yoga, something I'm familiar with for a long time. It helps you to do a deep dive into the nervous system and enhances some dimensions of inner expansion. And I want to be quick to say this, that I believe if you're going to practice yoga and you're going to practice seriously, that it's always good to spend plenty of time practicing straight. I really do think that's so. I also think, however, that blending cannabis with yoga, and I don't mean, doing like 6 dab hits. I think you'd just be too out of it to do anything but sit down. But enough just to get a sense of expansion opens up a lot in yoga practice. For one thing, cannabis is activating the endocannabinoid system at the very same time that yoga is working on the nervous system. And the endocannabinoid system directly works on the nervous system as well. So you get this intersection of yoga and, cannabis. And basically what happens is, as these two come together, if you concentrate, if you pay attention, you can go deeper and at the very same time have a greater sense of expansion. And we know that the expansion that we feel in psychedelics and the expansion that we feel with cannabis, which is certainly a psychedelic in high oral doses, is the loosening up of graven neural pathways, habits, behaviors that may not suit us ideally, and the opening up of many additional neural pathways to give us a greater, broader depth of opportunity in our behavior. So instead of reacting one particular way, we have a variety of ways that we can choose to react to or respond to a situation. Basically, with yoga practice, with or without cannabis, you are boosting electricity. We do actually, for real, mathematically have millions of volts of electricity going through our bodies, going on in our bodies all at once. It's a wonder we can't just hold light bulbs in our hand and turn them on and off. I don't know why we can't, actually. But in any case, with yoga practice, you not only become more aware of this energy by feeling it, but you are also able to boost and amplify it. And this can give you great dynamic energy and vitality and enhanced mental clarity. And if you combine cannabis with yoga practice, it's easier to feel that electricity, to work with that electricity, and to help to boost and expand it. There is a phenomenon, many of you are probably familiar with it, called Kundalini. Kundalini is considered by yogis to be the essential force of spirit within the human being, the seat of genius and mind, as some have said. And when the conditions are right, and I have had this experience many times, so I'm not just blowing smoke here, sort of a perfect expression, I guess. It is possible with the fusion of yoga and with cannabis to have a stunning awakening of this energy, to have it drive up the spine in a profound and powerful way, to light up these energy centers, these chakras, these plexuses as it goes, to fill you inside with light, and in doing so, leave you in a clear, high, brilliant state that may actually last for weeks or even months. So this is a wonderful occurrence in yoga practice. Many ways to infuse for your practice, and I think those of you out there probably know many of these ways. Here, a good one is keef. Keef, as you know, is the resin glands of the ganja plant that have been shaken off and they haven't been pressed into hard hash, and a small keef pipe. This is a great way to go. A little pipe of this and boom, you're all set for yoga practice. You really don't have to go much further. Edibles also, big thing now. We're seeing a lot of culinary activity. The Cannabis Kitchen Cookbook, I happened to do some recipes for that. That was gobs of fun, although I did 7 recipes in a day, and unfortunately we had to try them all. And so after about 11 in the morning, it was pretty rough going for the remainder of the day because we were just so terribly high. But in any case, this is an emerging dimension of culinary art, and there's some beautiful things being done with edibles. The bang lassi is a typical and common shake in India. A lassi is a yogurt shake. Bang, which I mentioned before and showed a man making bang. Bang is ganja. On the event of Holi, which is a big national holiday in India, thousands and thousands of stands all over the country serve bang lassis to everybody. Men, women, children, old, young, cops, school teachers, you name it. Everybody goes out and drinks this stuff for one day and gets good and high on bang lassis. So smoothies, a little bit of a smoothie, a little bit of cannabis chai can also be a way to infuse prior to yoga. You don't want to eat too much, though. You want to have something small. You're probably all familiar with this, but I will tell you anyway that the cannabinoids, being resinous, are best soluble in fats of different kinds. And that's why recipes of all types have typically cooked the buds, the ground up buds of cannabis or hash or keef in butter to make a preparation that not only goes into other recipes very well, but also gets into your body quickly. The absorption of the cannabinoids when you eat cannabis is always far superior in the presence of fat, whether it's butter, whether it's coconut oil, whether it's olive oil. I like butter. I think it works great. I found many years ago a 16-volume set of the Arabian Nights, the Burton edition. And in there, in the footnotes, I found reference to Majun, which is what you see here. Majun is made with dried fruits, dried nuts, sweet aromatic spices like cinnamon, clove, and cardamom, hashish, and butter. And the hashish is cooked in the butter. The butter is then mixed with the finely chopped and ground dried fruits and nuts and spices. It's all mushed together and just kneaded and kneaded and kneaded for a while, and then made into either balls or fingers. And for convenience, I also roll them in coconut, shredded coconut, because I find that in doing so, they're easier to handle. They don't stick to each other. But Majun is a type of electuary, a type of sweet treat that is derives from Arabia. And this stuff is really spectacularly tasty. You just have to be careful as you're dosing. I generally estimate that about 1/3 of a gram of fresh high potency or high potency ganja flower per cookie, per brownie, per Majun, whatever, and about 1/6 of a gram of hashish for the same thing. Now, people can do more. I've done more. I would also caution you, if you like to make edibles, before you give them to anybody else, please try them on yourself. That seems to be the responsible thing to do. There's a profusion of products of all different types. Here at a cannabis festival in Negril Beach 2 years ago in Jamaica, one woman had a whole variety of muffins and jellies of different kinds. And so here she is showing off some of her gummies. Gummies are vastly popular. Whatever you do to infuse for your yoga practice, you certainly don't want to have something that's too strong so that you're wasted and can't practice. And you also don't want to have something too big. I mean, people are making cannabis lasagna, but that's not what you want before yoga practice. So you try to have something that's moderate in size as well as moderate in potency. We're going to see, and we're already seeing, cannabis making a change in people's habits relative to their use of over-the-counter and prescription drugs. We're seeing especially people trying cannabis instead of some of the anti-anxiety drugs, in some of the instead of some of the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor antidepressants, instead of some of the sleep drugs. I mean, my wife, for example, will have a little bit of brownie before going to sleep, and she insists that it makes her night's sleep infinitely better. So we're going to see much of this take place. I think over the next 10, 15 years or so, there's going to be a big shakeup with a lot more people turning to cannabis and turning away from some of these toxic pharmaceuticals. You're all familiar, and MAPS is a big proponent of this. You're all familiar with the emergence of cannabis-assisted psychotherapy, just as we have psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, people on LSD, people on other true psychedelics being assisted by a psychotherapist. Many people can relax more, feel much more open to speak candidly if they've gotten a little bit high. And so this is something that we will see more of as well. We know that the experiential churches are also taking off. I mean, probably the most famous psychoactive church, if you will, that we have in the United States is the Native American church, where peyote is consumed as a sacrament to the Great Spirit, and you sit up all night long, and you sing and you meditate and you get deep in the spirit of that medicine. From the Rastafari religion to modern groups like the Elevationists, we have people who are utilizing cannabis very much the way it's being utilized in temples in India, as a sacrament, as an agent of reverie, as something to make connection with spirit. And in doing so, we're seeing a somewhat significant movement. I was up in Orange Hill in Jamaica, which is one of the central ganja growing areas, and here is a Rastafarian, a guy named Ted, who is also a wonderful grower, showing his small but luscious plants. Also, we have the Sisters of the Valley Cannabis Nuns in Northern California. These women are utterly devoted to the plants, to the spirit of the plant, to the sacred nature of the plant, to the sacred handling of the plant. Many people find that when they grow cannabis, they get a wonderful energetic connection with the plants. I certainly do. It's really the greatest pleasure of growing my own, besides having so much available to give away to people, which I've always felt was the spirit of ganja. But so there's a lot of sacred reference, a lot of going toward the sacred, going toward spirit that happens quite naturally with cannabis, which kind of cycles back to the suggestion that Shiva, or the divine or spirit somehow bestowed both yoga and cannabis on humanity. We'll also see at the very same time that we have a proliferation of beverages and people doing distillates and stuff that I just don't even know why we bother with them. We're going to see much more artisanal ganja. people will become somewhat disappointed with the Budweisers and the Millers of cannabis. They're going to want the good stuff. And fortunately, we have spectacular landrace strains out there: Acapulco Gold, Panama Red, Congolese, Thai, Himalayan, Afghani, so much more. We're going to see not only a greater push for the pure landrace strains, just like we see heirloom vegetables coming back to many of the finer grocery stores, but we're also going to see sort of a strong wave of this artisanal ganja, even in the face of these huge cannabis companies and acquisitions and multi-$100 million vertically integrated grow, manufacturing, and retail operations. There's a whole other thing going on out there with people tending soil and growing ganja. I also think that we're going to see much more cannabis tripping and much more talk about it. There was the Club de Hashishan, or Hashishin rather, in Paris in the early 1900s, where many of the great authors at the time, went and they would eat this particular product, dawa mesk. And dawa mesk, which is this right here, in their instance was Algerian hashish, butter, pistachio, finely ground, and sweet aromatic spices and honey all mixed together. And they would eat sufficient enough quantities that they would go way past getting high. They would just flat out trip and have lavish visions. If you've eaten humongous quantities of cannabis by mistake, or for that matter on purpose, then you know that it is also a spectacular psychedelic with full visionary capacity. One of the greatest experiences I ever had was a hash trip in Kathmandu, Nepal, that started early in the morning and went very, very, very late at night, and was in all ways just luminous and brilliant. And I really got a sense of tremendous spirit during that event. This is my father-in-law. He's now like 93. Here he is holding a couple of branches of my harvest a few years back. Cannabis has gone a long way with humanity. Cannabis is a profound medicine that is showing greater and greater value for more things. And also as an agent of reverie, cannabis is attracting more people for yoga practice, for meditation, and for any number of the other arts that involve concentration and meditative discipline. I have a new book out called The Lotus and the Bud. This is the only commercial you're going to get: Cannabis, Consciousness, and Yoga Practice, in which I take a very, very deep dive into the history, legend, and lore of cannabis and of yoga and of fusion of the two. A terrific section on hashish. So I hope you'll tune into that, The Lotus and the Bud. I'd like to thank you for listening to me and for this segment. And now I'd like to turn this back over to you, Michael, and to some questions that we might have from the group.
Yes, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Chris. That was wonderful. Awesome to hear your fascinating perspective on this plant. And we do have lots of questions, so we'll get right into that. We have a question from Melissa Ruckmick, who asks, Chris, I also am curious with your wisdom regarding the supply chain with indigenous peoples around the world, how the best way forward is to both keep their ability to make a profit from a plant-based medicine, but also to take care of the habitat environment it comes from.
Well, these are huge things, and I won't be able to sufficiently address it all. But I think one thing is that, we've ripped off people with cannabis for a long time. I mean, I saw a show of Arjun, the guy from Sensi Seeds, going to Congo and looking for these rare and precious seeds and getting them, and basically not giving the people anything and just leaving them standing there with their pockets turned out. And if we're going to boast that we've got Afghani or we've got Thai or we've got this or that, I really do think that part of it is not only giving recognition to the sources, but also sharing benefits with the sources. Benefit sharing. I mean, we do this all the time in the botanical trades that I work with. If a product is successful, then in addition to people getting paid for that, for kilos or tons of whatever the herbs are, also funds accrue back for community development, for school development, for medicine, dentistry, infrastructure, water, electrical, all that stuff. There are a lot of poor people out there who deserve to do better. So I think in terms of sustainability, one of the things we have to do is get our house in order and stop ripping off people for their precious seeds. Those Congolese people, their lives could have been transformed had the right thing been done, and it wasn't. I think in terms of environmental protection, what I see, because I traveled the world very, very widely, and I go to some places that are horrifically, terribly, devastatingly poor, is that poor people will do absolutely anything, burn down trees, whatever they have to feed their families and stay alive, and you can't blame them because that's survival. And if there's some sort of cooperative sustainable trade program and people that they genuinely want and feel good about, then it's possible to set in motion any number of healthy environmental practices. Most people don't want to destroy the environments around them. They do it out of need often. So I think that a lot of it has to do with rearranging our entire sense of what the business part of this is about, and whether we care more about profits or more about everybody doing well and thriving and prospering in a difficult world.
Yeah, totally. I think you're kind of getting now into like the point you brought up about the pharmaceuticals and how plant medicines are starting to encroach on the profits that are being made there. So hopefully that process can assist in just restructuring some of that business practice and reshaping our ethics around that.
And also, look, if you grow ganja, give a ton of it away. Just do.
Right. It's
grow more than you need. Just plain grow more than you need and give it away. I go to a party, I bring a jar of ganja, and people are like, yeah, man, this is great. Why not? I mean, share the love. It's not all about money.
That's beautiful. So the next question here is from Ethan. I think he's got kind of a couple of questions here. So are you planning to attend Lavasani's Plant Medicine Coalition first annual conference in June? Is kind of the first part of the question. Then following from that, how do you feel about decriminalization versus legalization?
Okay, first question, I didn't know about it, and I'd love to know about it. I'm just not familiar with this gathering in June. So I'd love to know more about it.
Yeah, okay, awesome. And I'll expand on the second question. So the second part is, how do you feel about decriminalization versus legalization? Like how cannabis and now psilocybin containing mushrooms are now decriminalized in some places, allows the user less risk legally, and also keeps big businesses out of that community. But also without legalization, scientific study is restricted.
Well, look, all of this is based on a mess. All of it. On a mistaken idea that these agents should be illegal. I mean, William F. Buckley Jr., one of the most conservative people ever alive, advocated like 40 years ago that they just all be made, just decriminalized across the board. The legal framework that exists for cannabis and for psychedelics is, in my opinion, clumsy and, because we have stupid fundamental drug laws, everything that derives from that is fundamentally flawed. If it were just all decriminalized, I assure you there would still be research. There would still be research, but there wouldn't necessarily be the same gold rush mentality. So I would rather see global decriminalization. Just plain stop regulating these things. Stop it. and make sure that people follow all other rules. Don't drive more than the speed limit, don't set your house on fire, don't shoot a gun off down the street in your neighborhood. I mean, all the sensible stuff. So I think decriminalization is absolutely the way to go, because any legal framework based on the existing legal framework is by definition flawed and crazy.
Absolutely. That's quite archaic. We have another question here from Omar, who asks about THC. So his question is, what do you think about the cannabis industry continuously breeding super high THC containing cannabis, leading to a very narrow CBD content, which ultimately increases the amount of anxiety that cannabis induces and nullifies the counterbalancing effect that CBD has?
Well, there's a point at which it's just too much. I remember my friends had this stuff that I called heart attack weed. It was so strong. It was like being hit in the face by a refrigerator. I mean, it was just so strong. But the problem was it was terrifying, okay? And so after a while, I didn't want to smoke their dope. It was just too much. It was just like, why would I go through this? This is terrifying. I don't think that breeding, I was like, wow, man, we got 28% THC. Who cares? I don't know. Have 2 hits instead of 1 of the Panama Red and be happy. I really, I like the balance of THC and CBD. I don't think that people should have to be freaked out or, feel like they need to run into the panic room or get under a desk when they smoke. And so I think there's a limit. When I've smoked like landrace strains, like especially the Himalayan stuff, it's not the strongest cannabis I've ever smoked. Oh, but it sure is one of the best. And so, I'm not impressed. Just like I'm not impressed by dabbing. I'm not impressed by the distillates. Some of it's too much. And also some of the products that are made out there are made with butane and other exotic solvents. And I don't want anything to do with that. I don't know why anybody would.
Yeah, kind of on that note, a question that I had for you is whether or not you have a particular favorite strain or type of cannabis. And kind of on that note, you mentioned Himalayan strains. I'm curious if you could maybe elaborate on what really appeals for you for those type of strains.
Well, I do grow, I grow Kali Mist pretty regularly. I've grown a British Columbian strain called Pine Warp, which is, and I rename them here. I figure you grow it in a different area, it becomes a different cannabis, but I'm always willing to give attribution. But, they're both hardy, they're both strong to grow outdoors. Relatively mold resistant, and a beautiful elevating high. I don't, certainly don't like cannabis that, just kind of plows your face into the couch or, excuse me, makes you useless in some ways. I like, I will sometimes have a bit of cannabis and then go out and stack wood or rake or something, just so in that sense, I like the energizing strains, and I think people need to experiment, find what works for you, find what you like. There are so many good things out there. And while I do think that the entire sativa indica thing is a botanical joke that was started by Lamarck in the 1700s, and we've been, pranked ever since, there are a lot of beautiful hybrids out there that are worth trying.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, that was one of the later questions here was kind of what are your thoughts on the whole sativa indica thing? So it's good to know. We have another question here from Roni. I'm just going to kind of paraphrase it. I believe the question is just kind of around the habitual use of cannabis. So do you feel that cannabis can be healthily used every day?
It depends on who you are, as is the case with everything. Some people don't get on with cannabis at all. I know a guy who is very familiar with psychedelics and good with them, and he can't smoke cannabis. It just doesn't do it for him. It puts them in a wrong state.
Mm-hmm.
So not everybody gets on with the plant anyway. But I would also say that daily is, I mean, I think daily is fine, you know, and I don't think we necessarily have to go through all the various historical figures who smoked every day. I mean, Louis Armstrong, Carl Sagan, you know, whoever we have to pick to just, I don't think we have to justify it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it is absolutely the case that some people do spend too much time and energy just only getting wrecked. And I don't think that's particularly productive or balanced. But having some cannabis every day, I mean, I do most days. When I travel to foreign countries, I don't, because, you know, often international laws prohibit that. And I don't want to wind up in a, you know, whatever, a jail in some crazy place. But I don't really think there's anything wrong with it. I think it's a matter of, most people know if they're doing too much, is the fact of the matter.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they admit it to others. And if you feel that way, then back off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great point. Thanks for sharing that. It kind of overlaps a little bit with the question that I had for you, which was maybe in the same vein, just around kind of the addictive quality of cannabis. I know early on, or the lack thereof, I should say, you know, like early on before cannabis was more mainstream now, people would often cite its addictive qualities as being part of the reason why it needs to be made illegal. And obviously there's been lots of research done that's shown that cannabis isn't really physically addictive. But I think on the other hand, like maybe people could say that it seems to have some sort of like habitual addictiveness. Like people can really get into a habit of using it unhealthily. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that at all.
Well, I mean, I think I did just somewhat. You can overdo it. There's no question about it. And, you know, all the warning signs of that apply in a manner not dissimilar from the overuse of other things, although it's safer than, say, overusing pharmaceuticals or alcohol. But, you know, if, for example, you're less productive, if, for example, you have a hard time doing things you've always been able to do, if you find that your relationships aren't as good or your mood is not right, well, then, you know, these are warning signs.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, at the same time, I have met some people who, however they're put together, they're not right. They don't feel right. They never really have. And then when they smoke a little, it's like the sun has come up. And whatever happens biochemically for those people, they appear to need cannabis daily. But yes, look, you can abuse anything. You can harm your life with anything by doing too much of it. Cannabis is no exception. I've been in endless numbers of ayahuasca ceremonies where people were there to get a handle on their cannabis use, which was way out of control and way out of line. So it's a real thing that happens to people. Fortunately, cannabis is not physically addictive in the true sense. You can suddenly be put on a bus and taken away to an island, and you're not going to go through the DTs, but you might ask, anybody got a joint? So, you know, you have to be careful with it, and it's not for kids, and definitely not for kids ever. Don't give it to kids. I mean, okay, if children are having seizures and you're doing something like Rick Simpson oil, that's different. But don't start getting kids stoned, because that can be problematic.
Totally. Thanks for sharing that, Chris. The next question we have is from Melissa. It's a bit of a technical question. It's, Chris, could you speak to us regarding utilizing cannabis along with perhaps other nervines, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, like valerian in combination to work with challenges like PTSD, neurological disorders, etc. From an energetic as well as a medicinal perspective, do you feel they could work synchronistically?
Well, cannabis is no different than all other botanicals. It can be utilized with other botanicals. I mean, I found years and years ago, for example, that if I took some fluid rhodiola rosea extract after smoking, that I got like just a little bit extra kind of sharper, clarity of mind. And I like that. So I do that a lot. I'll have a little bit of rhodiola, when I get high. Cannabis is an ingredient, even though it's a featured plant, or many people consider it a master plant. It can also be utilized as an ingredient. You know that in much of European medicine and virtually all of traditional Chinese medicine and most of Ayurvedic medicine, they don't use herbs by themselves. They use them in combination with others. So if you find that you have a relaxing variety of cannabis and you add it, maybe you also have some kava, or you have some valerian or passion flower, then you can use that as part of a formula for a calming effect. You can also, if you really want to kind of, give a real boost, you can combine cannabis with rhodiola, panax, ginseng, maybe a little bit of coffee, and then you've got something else going on that's more energizing. So absolutely use cannabis the way you would other herbal ingredients, and match it to those botanicals that serve the need you're going for.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Chris. So there's a question. I'm just trying to go through and find some relevant questions here, because there's some really interesting questions that might be a bit open-ended. But nonetheless,
I'm open-ended.
Okay. Well, there's a question here from Julia that is, what is the essence of your spiritual beliefs?
The essence of my spiritual beliefs
Yeah.
is that we are spirit and flesh,
Mhm.
that the universe is a big friendly place, that we can know spirit, we can know pure spirit. I was brought up in a family of broadcasters and ministers. So I was exposed to, going to church regularly as a kid and all that. And my grandfather was a staggeringly brilliant minister, and I loved to hear him preach. And if he were alive today, I'd go hear him to this day. He was just that good. But I adhere to no religion. I have no particular isms, ologies, or osophies. I mean, I sit with shamans and have for, an awful lot of number of times, but, I'm not particularly into shamanism. I appreciate the teachings of Buddha, but I'm not particularly into Buddhism. Really, I just accept that we are spirit and that we navigate this world as spirit in flesh. And that we are designed and built with the capability to more fully and deeply and richly apprehend spirit through various practices and things that have, come down through antiquity. Some of these are psychedelics. Psychedelics are great aids for cracking open the cosmic egg, as what was his name? Joseph Chilton Pierce said. But having a practice of some kind, a meditation practice, yoga, tai chi, something meditative, something reflective, that in which you take time every single day to orient yourself to your deepest spiritual self and to move forward through there. That's what I believe in. And I also believe in action. I believe that if we are spiritually aware, that we demonstrate that in our behavior. And spiritually aware behavior, in my estimation, is humane behavior. It's friendly behavior. It's life imbuing behavior. Appreciation of the wonder of nature, of the absolute marvel and mystery of existence, all of that. So I don't know if I've given you a good answer.
I think you gave a great answer. That's a wonderful essence. So thank you so much for sharing that. It's a great answer.
Sure.
I think Julia will be very happy that you shared that. And my kind of follow-up question I had from that was, can you kind of any particular experiences with cannabis that maybe have helped guide you towards finding that as your spiritual essence? Or Did you use cannabis as
Sure.
a spiritual tool at a younger age?
Well, no, when I was getting high as a teenager, and for the first few years that I was utilizing cannabis, I was just, doing what my friends and I were doing. We were getting high and having fun. And however, I have to say, I always had a sense of cannabis kind of like rubbing right up against spirituality, even at an early age. And as my friends and I began to read, books like Autobiography of a Yogi and other things, and we got turned on to different practices. Many of us kept cannabis in our lives, or to some extent, and found ways that it fit very nicely into spiritual practice. But God, I'm sorry. I just totally lost
Okay.
where I am. What was your question?
We were just talking about spirituality and cannabis, and like whether you've, at a younger age, if you used cannabis particularly as a tool for that.
And then was there a particular experience? There were a couple of experiences. One, I suffered some terrible injuries. I broke my 7th cervical vertebra. I had a ladder fall on my head from a building. I was in a near fatal car accident, and all these things caused me real distress, and at different times. And it was after the breaking of my 7th cervical vertebra, I found that if I sat in full lotus position and smoked a little cannabis and stayed there, sometimes for hours, that I could completely eliminate the excruciating pain that I was feeling all day long. And when I did that, I wound up going into just profoundly deep, amazing meditative states.
Wow.
That was one thing. And then when I went to Nepal, and I went to a place called the Machendranath temple, where there was chanting every night in the oldest part of Kathmandu. And the musicians, before singing, would smoke bong together. And I went there for 9 nights. And each night that I went there, they invited me up to smoke with them. And so I would smoke with them. And then I'd go sit and listen to them. And I would go into these deep, deep, deep journeys, very much the way you would have a journey on ayahuasca, listening to the Icaros of the shamans. And that was when the full connection with yoga and cannabis really became real to me. And I got the depth of that in a place that had this, spiritual vibe from antiquity, and this long tradition of practice and worship. So those were a couple of things that really pushed me forward in terms of the connection between cannabis and my overall general spiritual life. I mean, obviously, if for some reason I had to give up one or the other, I'd give up cannabis before I'd ever give up yoga practice and meditation.
Yeah.
That's a given.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's really interesting. That's really crazy. Thanks for sharing that. We have time for a couple more questions, I think. So we've got one here from Tom. Tom asks, can you speak to the creative activities you like to engage in while communing with cannabis? Have any of your visionary experiences translated into music, illustration, or otherwise?
I've written most of my books high, and I've got 15 books out there.
There you
go. Definitely, and again, you can't be too loaded. I mean, I'm not talking about getting wasted. But I find that if I'm going to sit for hours and I'm going to craft language, and if I'm going to look up references, and if I'm going to, fashion paragraphs that pack a lot in, and which is a whole creative process, that I like to do it a bit high, not super high, but a bit high. Other things, I mean, gosh, taking walks with friends in the forest, which is something I do most days.
Mm-hmm.
That is a creative thing. It doesn't result in music or a finished piece of writing, but certainly. So I would say for me, in terms of creative acts, I've certainly written many thousands of pages of materials, somewhat high.
That's wonderful to hear. Thanks for answering that question.
Yeah.
We have one more question here, I think, from Sonia. And Sonia asks, is it true that there is a kind of fermentation in the charas due to weed fungus or other issues related to how it's dried or handled?
Charas in general will not be fermented, no. But I have seen moldy hash that is not, hygienically made, or poorly pressed, can and will get, excuse me, veins of mold through it. And that's something that you want to be very careful of, because molds that accumulate on cannabis can also infect the lungs and be quite damaging. But in general, the charas that I've encountered, and I've encountered a decent amount of it, it's been fine. It hasn't had. I've had a remarkably acute sense of smell from doing work with scents and fragrances, and I've never smelled any fermentation or rot or anything, except when I've seen hash that has had visible mold. So I would say no.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. And I kind of had one more question for you. If would you be able to share one message that you feel like, if cannabis was a person and could talk to us, like what would cannabis want to say to the world? Would you be able to share a message in that capacity?
Well, I mean, it's almost like the old Youngblood song, come on, people, smile on your brother. Everybody get together, try to love one another right now. I mean,
that sounds about right.
I'm sure he was stoned when he wrote that song. And, Snoop Dogg said a really interesting thing in an interview a couple of months ago. I heard he said, you take 100 brothers who don't even like each other. You put them in a room with a bunch of ganja, and in a short while, they're going to be taking selfies with each other. You put 3 brothers in a room with a bottle of alcohol, one's going to die. And I think that the fact is that cannabis's message is its effect. And its effect is friendly. I mean, I know that there are gangbangers who get high and commit crimes and stuff, but for the most part, that's not what people do. For the most part, cannabis is largely an agent of it's friendly. It's an agent of kinship. I mean, I don't know how many circles of people I've stood around in sharing joints, but it's certainly been many hundreds in my life, I mean, and it's not that you can't also just smoke one yourself, but I think that cannabis does speak to us plainly in its effects. And let's do something fun. Well, that's an expression of the cannabis rather than, let's go beat the crap out of the people down the street. I mean, who comes up with ideas like that, I would say also that cannabis is, people say cannabis is not a gateway drug. It most certainly is. For my friends and me, it was a gateway to natural foods, to yoga, to meditation, to herbs, to home gardening, to natural lifestyle, for many things. It really just opened us up that way. It was like, well, we're smoking dope now. Shouldn't we be eating brown rice? I mean, it sounds idiotic to say, but that's kind of how it was. So I would say to you that the cannabis, I think there are 2 things. One, the cannabis does speak to us through its effects. And just to kind of take a little walk on the wild side, it's also the case that when you infuse with cannabis, especially if you're in a private place, you can call on the spirit of the plant. And the first bunch of times you do that, you're going to be pretty sure it's just you and your imagination talking to yourself. But at some point, you'll have free and open contact with the spirit of the plant.
Mm.
And you won't have a conversation with it, I don't think. It's not going to say to you, hey, do this. But the overall effect of that massive spirit, which is extremely powerful, monstrous, global, will deeply impress you. And it seems to be an overall harmonizing and expanding impression. So I would say, you want to know the intent and the spirit of the plant, sit with yourself and understand its effects. And that will give you that information.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chris. I think that's a
Sure.
wonderful kind of last question to end on. But we are, approaching the end of time here, and I wanted to turn things over to you if there's any kind of last comments you wanted to share with the audience.
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank you, Michael. You've been a wonderful host for these 4 sessions that we've done with Ethnobotany of psychoactive plants. And I want to thank all of you people who have joined in. This is wonderful for me. I love doing this stuff. I not only love my work in the field, but I also really love sharing it and communicating with people. So I thank you all for joining in. And I do want to say, plants are actually our closest allies. I mean, we eat them, we drink their juices, we make houses out of them, we wear them as clothing, we adorn ourselves with them, we use them as medicines. It goes on and on and on. And we tinker with them endlessly. I get up in the morning after I shower, the first thing I do is drink a plant stuff. It happens to be called coffee. But I would say that, we're in such a wonderful time in terms of information. Learn what you can about the plants, learn from the other experts who are out there, expand your knowledge, contribute to that knowledge, because right now, as about 70% of the world's population lives in or is moving to cities, we need more and more people who have a good, solid connection with nature in any and all ways that that's possible, to kind of be guiding lights out there. Because what we don't want to do is wind up being mechanized, urbanized, and denatured. That would be a disaster. So for all of you, I want to thank you for your time and for your attention, for being here. I want to thank MAPS again. And who knows, we'll most likely run into each other someplace down the road.
Absolutely. That sounds amazing. Thank you again, Chris, so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Bless you all.
All right. So to close off the session today, I would love to thank Chris again so much for joining us for this series and for sharing his incredible stories around plant medicines. This has been the first expert edition series that we have run, and we could not have asked for a more knowledgeable and charismatic guest for this first installment. Now, remember, you can always rewatch any of the episodes from this series right here in Crowdcast, just following the direct links. Our next expert edition series will be announced at a later time, but until then, I'm really excited to share a bit of a sneak peek just with you for our next event happening in early April, where we will be hosting a psychedelic peer support event. So more details on that can be announced later this week, but make sure to save the dates, April 8th and April 14th, 5 p.m. PST for that, and with more details to come. So we really appreciate everyone that has turned out for this series with Chris. Even just showing up and taking the time to educate yourself on these subjects goes a long way in bringing us closer to a brighter future where psychedelic medicines are more widely accepted and integrated into society. As you might know, research is very expensive, and the psychedelic renaissance is built on a foundation of solid research into psychedelics. To continue the momentum and build a strong case for psychedelics, more research needs to be done, and so we appreciate any and all donations that are made, as these go directly to funding this important research. So that's it for this series. Make sure to stay tuned for future announcements on our next event later this week, and thank you again to everyone that's been attending, and we'll make sure to see you again soon.